What if I told you that Academy Award winner Anthony Hopkins' most transformative role wasn't on the silver screen, but in a humble Amish farmhouse in Pennsylvania? In the summer of 2023, the legendary actor traded his Hollywood mansion for a life without electricity, phones, or modern comforts. What happened next defied everything he thought he knew about success and happiness. When an Amish father named Eli Zook opened his door to Hopkins, neither man could have predicted how their worlds would collide. The simple wisdom shared over morning chores would shake Hopkins to his core, leading him to make a decision that stunned Hollywood. What did Hopkins discover in those quiet fields that changed him forever? And why did this experience cause him to walk away from a $20 million movie deal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The golden statuettes gleamed under the recessed lighting, their metallic surfaces reflecting distorted images of the man who stood before them. Anthony Hopkins traced a trembling finger along the engraved plate of his most recent Academy Award, but the cold touch of success offered no comfort against the crushing weight in his chest. The spacious living room of his Hollywood Hills mansion, with its soaring ceilings and panoramic views of Los Angeles, suddenly felt like a gilded cage closing in around him. How many times had he rehearsed acceptance speeches, practiced that perfect blend of humility and grace? Yet here, in the privacy of his own home, the carefully constructed facade began to crack. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, each inhale a struggle against the invisible vice grip around his lungs. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man celebrated for his ability to portray raw human emotion now found himself drowning in his own. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights twinkled like fallen stars, each one representing another soul chasing the same dreams he'd caught. But what happened when you caught everything you'd ever wanted? When the applause faded and the cameras stopped rolling, what remained? The question echoed in the emptiness of his million-dollar home, bouncing off marble countertops and designer furniture that suddenly seemed meaningless. His phone buzzed incessantly, agents, directors, journalists all demanding pieces of him. Each notification felt like another small cut, drawing blood from an already wounded spirit. He'd mastered the art of becoming other people, but somewhere along the way, Anthony Hopkins had lost touch with himself. The roles had become his refuge, each character a mask to hide behind, until the man beneath them all became a stranger. The panic attack gripped him with familiar intensity, a testament to how frequent these episodes had become. His hands shook as he reached for the glass of water on the coffee table, sending ripples across its surface that matched the tremors in his soul. The pristine white walls of his home felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with their perfection. When had success become such a burden? Memories flooded his mind. The standing ovations, the critical acclaim, the respect of his peers. Yet each achievement now felt hollow, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer formed a complete picture. He'd climbed to the pinnacle of his profession, but the view from the top was lonelier than he'd ever imagined. The very accolades that should have brought fulfillment now mocked him with their emptiness. His agent's words from earlier that day rang in his ears. "You're at the height of your career, Tony. The world is yours for the taking." But what good was having the world when you'd lost yourself in the process? The roles kept coming, each one more prestigious than the last. But the joy of performance had been replaced by a mechanical precision that left him feeling like an automaton rather than an artist. In the reflection of the window, he barely recognized himself. The distinguished actor who commanded attention on screen and stage now looked vulnerable, almost fragile. The carefully maintained image of strength and sophistication crumbled in the face of this internal storm. How long had he been running from this moment, filling his schedule with work to avoid confronting the void that grew larger with each passing day? His gaze fell on a script lying on the coffee table, another potential award-winning role, another chance to lose himself in someone else's story. But for the first time in his celebrated career, the thought of stepping into another character's shoes filled him with dread rather than excitement. The words on the page, once a source of inspiration, now seemed like chains threatening to bind him further to this golden prison of his own making. The city sprawled below him, a tapestry of lights and shadows, dreams and disappointments. Somewhere out there, countless aspiring actors were probably looking up at these same hills, imagining the life he led. If only they could see him now, would they still envy his position? Would they understand that success, when stripped of meaning, becomes nothing more than a collection of empty victories? A sudden clarity cut through the panic. Something had to change. The question was no longer about what he wanted to achieve, but rather who he wanted to become. The accolades and acclaim had filled his home but left his heart empty. As his breathing slowly steadied, Anthony Hopkins realized he needed more than just another role to play. He needed to rediscover the man behind the performances. The manila envelope arrived on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, its weathered appearance standing out among the glossy fan mail and industry correspondence that typically flooded Anthony Hopkins' Beverly Hills mailbox. The return address, handwritten in precise penmanship, bore the name Eli Zook from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Hopkins turned the envelope over in his hands, intrigued by its simplicity and the faint scent of hay that clung to the paper. Inside, he found a letter written on plain stationery, the words carefully chosen and methodically penned. The invitation was unexpected, an Amish farmer requesting his presence for a 3-month stay to help prepare for the autumn harvest. The actor had received countless invitations throughout his career, but none quite like this. Eli Zook's words carried no pretense, no hidden agenda seeking Hollywood connections or financial gain. Instead, the letter spoke of learning from each other, of finding meaning in simple work, and of understanding a way of life untouched by the modern world's constant chaos. As Hopkins read further, he learned that Eli's son Samuel had left the Amish community years ago to pursue a career in medicine. This detail stirred something within him, the universal story of following one's calling, even when it meant leaving everything familiar behind. The letter mentioned how Samuel's choice had created a rift in their family, one that time had softened, but never fully healed. Hannah Zook, Eli's wife, had added a postscript in different handwriting, extending her own welcome and promising home-cooked meals that would make him forget about California cuisine. Her words carried warmth that transcended the paper, reminding Hopkins of his own mother's letters from years past. The timing of the invitation seemed almost prophetic. Hopkins had recently completed a grueling film schedule, and the endless cycle of scripts, interviews, and appearances had left him feeling increasingly disconnected from anything real. When was the last time he had experienced genuine human connection, unmarred by the expectations of fame? The letter concluded with a simple question that would echo in Hopkins' mind for days. In our community, we believe that every person has something to teach and something to learn. What might we learn from each other, Mr. Hopkins? As he sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his successful career, Hopkins found himself drawn to the authenticity of the invitation. The Zooks weren't offering him a role to play or a character to embody. They were inviting him to simply be present, to work alongside them, to experience life stripped of Hollywood's glitter and glamour. The decision to accept the invitation would mean stepping away from his carefully managed schedule, disappointing his agent and likely raising eyebrows in the industry. Yet, as Hopkins reread the letter, he recognized an opportunity that transcended professional considerations. Here was a chance to understand a way of life that prioritized community over individual achievement, tradition over innovation, and spiritual wealth over material success. He thought about Samuel Zook, now a doctor somewhere in the modern world, and wondered about the courage it took to leave everything familiar behind. What conversations might they have if their paths crossed? What insights could he gain from a family navigating the delicate balance between preserving their way of life and accepting their son's different path? The invitation represented more than just a temporary escape from Hollywood. It offered a window into a world where success was measured not by accolades or box office numbers, but by the strength of one's character and contributions to the community. Could 3 months among the Amish provide the perspective he didn't even know he was seeking? Hopkins reached for his phone, then stopped himself, remembering that the Zooks wouldn't have one. Instead, he pulled out his finest stationery and began composing his response. The words flowed easily, free from the usual careful consideration of public image or professional implications. For the first time in years, he wrote simply as himself, accepting an invitation that promised not entertainment or accolades, but something far more valuable: authenticity. As he sealed the envelope, Hopkins wondered what Eli and Hannah Zook would make of his acceptance. Would they see past his celebrity status to recognize someone genuinely seeking understanding? And what changes might await him in the simple life of Lancaster County, where the rhythms of days were dictated not by shooting schedules and press junkets, but by the rising and setting of the sun? The sleek black sedan seemed almost offensive against the pastoral landscape as it wound its way through Lancaster County's back roads. Anthony Hopkins sat in the back seat, his designer suit a stark contrast to the simple farmlands rolling past his window. How had a letter, written in careful longhand on plain paper, led him to trade the glamour of Hollywood for the simplicity of Amish country? The invitation from Eli Zook had arrived 3 months ago, surprising everyone in Hopkins's inner circle. His agent had initially dismissed it as another fan request, but something about the earnest words and unique proposition had caught Hopkins's attention. Eli had offered to teach him the art of traditional woodworking, a skill the actor had long admired but never pursued. As the car approached the Zook farm, Hopkins noticed a tall, bearded man in traditional Amish clothing standing near the gate. Eli Zook's presence commanded attention without demanding it, his weathered face bearing the quiet confidence of someone completely at peace with his place in the world. Beside him stood his wife Hannah, her simple dress and prayer cap reflecting the morning sun. The driver helped Hopkins with his luggage, the expensive leather bags looking almost shameful next to the modest farmhouse. Eli stepped forward, extending a calloused hand in greeting. "Welcome to our home, Mr. Hopkins." His voice carried the slight lilt characteristic of the Pennsylvania Dutch, but there was also a warmth that immediately put Hopkins at ease. Hannah's welcome was equally genuine, though her eyes held a hint of curiosity as she took in Hopkins' attire. "We've prepared the guest room in the Dottie house," she said, referring to the smaller house on their property traditionally used for grandparents. "I hope you'll find it comfortable." As they walked toward the house, Hopkins couldn't help but notice the careful organization of the farm, the neat rows of the vegetable garden, the well-maintained barn, and the woodworking shop, where he would spend much of his time. The pristine order spoke of lives lived with purpose and intention, so different from the carefully crafted chaos of film sets. Eli seemed to sense Hopkins's thoughts. "Our ways may seem strange to you at first," he said, leading the way to the Dottie house. "But there is peace in simplicity." His words carried no judgment, only an understanding that their worlds were about to intersect in unprecedented ways. The guest room reflected the Zook family's approach to life, clean, functional, and devoid of modern distractions. A handmade quilt adorned the bed, its intricate pattern telling stories of generations past. The furniture, Hopkins noticed with appreciation, had been crafted by hand, each piece bearing the marks of careful workmanship. Hannah excused herself to prepare lunch, leaving Hopkins with Eli. The two men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each measuring the other. Hopkins had portrayed countless characters throughout his career, but here he felt stripped of all pretense. How would he navigate this world where authenticity wasn't performed but lived? "Your son Samuel," Hopkins ventured, remembering the brief mention in Eli's letters. "Will he be joining us?" The slight tightening around Eli's eyes suggested a complex story, one that Hopkins suspected would unfold during his stay. "Samuel has his own path now," Eli replied, his tone carefully neutral. "He chose to leave our community to become a doctor." The pride and pain in those words were equally measured, hinting at the delicate balance between holding on to tradition and accepting change. The sound of horse hooves on gravel drew their attention to the window. A buggy was approaching, driven by what appeared to be another community member. Hopkins watched as Eli's expression softened slightly. This was a world of subtle gestures and unspoken understanding, where relationships were built on foundations far different from the transient connections of Hollywood. How would these next few weeks reshape both teacher and student? The question hung in the air as Hopkins began unpacking his belongings, each item from his world seeming more out of place in this environment of deliberate simplicity. Yet somehow, in the quiet of the Doughty house, surrounded by the evidence of Eli's craftsmanship, Hopkins felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of genuine transformation. Long before the sun crept over the horizon, Eli Zook's firm knock echoed through Anthony Hopkins' guest room door. The actor, accustomed to early call times on movie sets, found himself facing a different kind of dawn challenge. Through the darkness, Eli's voice carried a gentle but unmistakable authority. "Time to meet the morning, Anthony." In the dim light of a kerosene lamp, Hopkins fumbled with the borrowed plain clothes Hannah had left for him the previous evening. The rough fabric felt foreign against his skin, yet there was something oddly comforting about its simplicity. As he made his way down the creaking wooden stairs, the aroma of fresh coffee and Hannah's home-baked bread filled the air. Eli waited by the back door, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Without ceremony, he handed Hopkins a similar cup, the warmth seeping through the ceramic and into the actor's cold fingers. "Drink quick," Eli advised. "The cows won't wait for their morning milking." The barn loomed ahead, a dark silhouette, against the pre-dawn sky. Inside, the sweet smell of hay mingled with the earthier scents of livestock. The cows shifted in their stalls, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Eli demonstrated the milking technique with practiced ease, his hands moving in a rhythm as natural as breathing. Hopkins watched intently, studying Eli's movements, with the same dedication he'd applied to preparing for a challenging role. When it came his turn, he positioned himself on the small wooden stool, his hands hesitating near the cow's udder. "Gentle but firm," Eli instructed, "like playing a piano. Too soft and nothing happens. Too hard and you'll get kicked." The first attempts proved frustrating. The milk splattered more often than it streamed, and Hopkins' fingers cramped from the unfamiliar motion. Yet Eli's patience never wavered. He stood nearby, offering quiet guidance and occasional corrections, his presence both instructive and reassuring. As Hopkins finally found his rhythm, Eli shared stories of teaching Samuel the same task years ago. His voice carried a mixture of pride and wistfulness that spoke volumes about their complicated relationship. Samuel had quick hands, Eli remembered. Always eager to learn, that one. Perhaps too eager for some things. The chicken coop came, next where dozens of hens clucked expectantly at their approach. Eli demonstrated how to scatter feed while checking for eggs, moving with an efficiency born from years of practice. Hopkins discovered that collecting eggs required a delicate touch and careful timing. Too slow and the hens grew impatient. Too quick and eggs risked breaking. Throughout the morning, Hopkins found himself drawing parallels between this world and his own. The precision required for these tasks reminded him of memorizing lines and hitting marks on set. Yet here, every action served an immediate, tangible purpose. No second takes, no editing and post-production, just the raw authenticity of working with living creatures who depended on human care. As the sun finally breached the horizon, casting long shadows across the barnyard, Hannah appeared with fresh bread and more coffee. She watched with quiet approval as Hopkins successfully completed his morning tasks, her presence adding a maternal warmth to the scene. The three of them shared this simple breakfast standing in the yard, the steam from their cups rising into the crisp morning air. Hopkins noticed how Eli and Hannah moved in perfect synchronization, their years together evident in every unconscious gesture and unspoken understanding. It made him think of the most compelling performances he'd witnessed throughout his career, ones where the chemistry between actors transcended mere acting. Here was that same authentic connection, but crafted through decades of shared life rather than careful rehearsal. The morning's lessons extended beyond the practical skills of farming. In these few hours, Hopkins began to understand the rhythm of Amish life, the way each task flowed naturally into the next, how work and prayer intertwined without conscious thought, and how the absence of modern conveniences created space for something else entirely, something he couldn't quite name yet. but felt settling into his bones with each passing moment. As they finished their breakfast, Eli glanced at the son's position and nodded with satisfaction. "You learn quick," he observed, his words carrying more weight than simple praise. "But the day's just beginning. Ready for more?" Hopkins found himself nodding eagerly, surprising himself with his genuine enthusiasm for whatever challenges lay ahead. What other lessons waited in this world so different from his own? In the warm glow of Hannah's kitchen, Anthony Hopkins found himself drawn into a world far removed from the bright lights of Hollywood. The morning sun streamed through simple muslin curtains, casting gentle shadows across the well-worn wooden countertops where Eli Zook worked with practiced efficiency. "Would you mind helping me with these eggs?" Hannah asked, her voice carrying the gentle lilt characteristic of the Pennsylvania Dutch. Hopkins moved to assist her, noting how she worked without modern conveniences, yet maintained a graceful rhythm that spoke of years of experience. As they worked side by side, Hannah shared stories of Amish life that fascinated Hopkins. She explained how cooking wasn't merely about sustenance but served as a cornerstone of their community. Every dish carried meaning. Every recipe passed down through generations held stories of family gatherings, barn raisings, and Sunday fellowships. "In our world, we believe simplicity brings us closer to God," Hannah explained while kneading dough for fresh bread. "But simplicity doesn't mean we can't find joy in what we do." Her words resonated with Hopkins, who had spent decades in an industry where excess often overshadowed substance. The conversation naturally drifted to Samuel, and Hopkins noticed how Hannah's eyes softened at the mention of her son. Unlike Eli's more reserved responses about their son's choices, Hannah spoke with a mother's pride about Samuel's accomplishments, while acknowledging the complexity of his decision to leave their way of life. "Sometimes love means understanding. That different paths can lead to the same truth," she said, her hands never stopping their work as she prepared scrapple, a traditional Pennsylvania Dutch breakfast meat. Hopkins recognized in her words the same wisdom he'd encountered in some of the most compelling scripts he'd read throughout his career. The kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh coffee, a concession to English visitors that Hannah had incorporated into her morning routine. She explained how maintaining tradition while adapting to interact with the outside world required careful balance, much like the ingredients in her recipes. As they worked, Hopkins found himself sharing stories of his own journey from a working-class background in Wales to the heights of Hollywood. Hannah listened intently, drawing surprising parallels between his experiences and the Amish emphasis on humility and hard work. "Your world and ours might seem far apart," Hannah observed while showing Hopkins how to properly fold the egg mixture for a perfect farm breakfast. "But perhaps they're connected by the same human desires, to find purpose, to belong, to create something meaningful." The morning's activities revealed another layer of Amish life that Hopkins hadn't expected to encounter. Through Hannah's patient guidance, he began to understand how the rhythms of daily tasks created a meditation of sorts, each movement purposeful and connected to a larger whole. Their conversation touched upon the challenges of maintaining traditional values in a changing world. Hannah spoke of how some Amish communities struggled with these decisions, while others found ways to preserve their core beliefs while making necessary adaptations. Her insights offered Hopkins a new perspective on his own industry's struggles, with authenticity in an increasingly technological age. As Eli entered the kitchen, fresh from the morning's barn duties, Hopkins observed the wordless communication between husband and wife. A gentle nod, a shared glance that spoke of decades of partnership. It reminded him of the best theatrical performances he'd witnessed, where the most powerful moments often occurred in silence. Hannah began setting out plates of steaming food, the breakfast a testament to both tradition and practicality. The simple yet abundant spread represented everything Hopkins had learned that morning about Amish life: purposeful, nurturing, and deeply rooted in community. Through Hannah's kitchen window, Hopkins could see the farm coming alive with morning activity. Young children headed toward the one-room schoolhouse in the distance, their lunch pails swinging in rhythm with their steps. The scene captured the essence of what Hannah had shared about their way of life: a deliberate choice to live simply, yet fully. What started as a simple cooking lesson had evolved into a masterclass in understanding a different way of life. Hopkins found himself wondering how many other profound truths lay hidden in ordinary moments like these, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look beyond surface differences. The morning sun filtered through Hannah's kitchen window as Anthony Hopkins helped clear away the breakfast dishes, his mind still processing the wealth of knowledge Eli had shared during their early morning farm duties. As he placed the last plate in the drying rack, his attention caught on something peculiar: a slight gap in the wooden paneling near the windowsill. What drew his eye wasn't the gap itself, but rather the corner of what appeared to be a photograph peeking out from behind it. Curiosity got the better of him, and with a gentle tug, Hopkins carefully extracted the hidden image. The photograph, slightly worn at the edges, captured a proud young man in a white coat standing outside what appeared to be a medical school. The resemblance to Eli was unmistakable. This had to be Samuel, their son who had left the community. The young man's eyes held the same determined glint Hopkins had noticed in Eli's gaze, yet there was something more, a spark of defiance, of breaking free. Hannah's soft footsteps approached from behind, and Hopkins turned, feeling somewhat guilty for discovering what was clearly a carefully concealed treasure. But Hannah's face showed no anger, only a complex mixture of pride and melancholy as she gazed at the photograph in his hands. What stories lay behind this hidden memento of a son who had chosen a different path? That was taken the day Samuel received his white coat, Hannah explained, her voice carrying both warmth and a hint of wistfulness. A friend of his sent it to me secretly. She gently took the photograph, running her finger along its edge with maternal tenderness. The simple action spoke volumes about the complicated nature of love, tradition, and the price of following one's dreams. Hopkins observed how Hannah's eyes lingered on her son's image, noting how she seemed to be memorizing every detail as if the photograph might disappear at any moment. How many times had she stolen quiet moments to gaze at this hidden connection to her son's new life? The concealed photograph represented more than just a moment frozen in time. It embodied the delicate balance between holding on to loved ones and letting them forge their own path. Through careful questioning, Hopkins learned that Samuel had left the community 8 years ago to pursue his medical studies. While such a decision meant formal separation from the Amish way of life, Hannah revealed that she occasionally received word of Samuel's accomplishments through discreet channels. Her eyes brightened as she shared that he now worked as a doctor in a Philadelphia hospital, helping others while living in the English world. The conversation shifted to Eli's perspective, and Hannah's voice softened further. She explained how her husband struggled with Samuel's choice, not because of anger or disappointment, but because of fear. Fear that his son would lose his way in the modern world. Fear that their family bonds would dissolve entirely. Yet beneath Eli's stoic exterior lay a father's endless love, evidenced by how he would sometimes pause his work to gaze in the direction of Philadelphia, as if he could somehow sense his son's presence across the miles. Hannah's revelation provided Hopkins with a deeper understanding of the complex dynamics at play within this family. How did one reconcile the preservation of traditional values with the natural human desire to explore, to grow, to change? The hidden photograph served as a powerful symbol of this ongoing struggle, tucked away yet carefully preserved, much like the love between parent and child that endured despite physical and cultural separation. As Hannah carefully returned the photograph to its hiding place, Hopkins noticed how her movements held both practiced familiarity and profound reverence. This simple act seemed to encapsulate the essence of their situation, the delicate balance between honoring tradition and accepting change, between holding on and letting go. What other hidden stories lay beneath the surface of this seemingly simple Amish life? The moment was interrupted by the sound of Eli's boots on the porch steps, returning from his morning tasks. Hannah quickly smoothed the wooden panel back into place, but the knowledge of what lay behind it had already transformed Hopkins's understanding of this family's journey. He realized that his time with the Zooks was revealing layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated when he first arrived to learn about the Amish way of life. What other revelations awaited him as he continued to peel back the layers of this rich and nuanced story? The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields as Anthony Hopkins followed Eli Zook's steady stride between the golden stalks. The actor's hands, more accustomed to holding scripts than farm tools, gripped the wooden handle of a scythe. After discovering Samuel's photograph the previous evening, Hopkins found himself viewing his Amish host through a different lens, not just as a simple farmer, but as a father whose world had been forever altered by his son's choices. "The wheat tells us when it's ready," Eli explained, demonstrating the proper cutting motion. His movements were precise, born from years of practice and an intimate understanding of the land. "Too early, and we waste what could have been. Too late, and we lose it all to the birds and weather." Hopkins observed Eli's technique, noting how the older man's body moved in harmony with the tool. The actor had portrayed countless roles throughout his career, but none had prepared him for the raw authenticity of this moment. "How did you know when Samuel was ready?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could reconsider its impact. Eli's hands stilled on the scythe, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the morning mist still clung to the trees. "Perhaps I didn't," he admitted, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to settle between the rows of wheat. "We think we can read our children like we read the crops, but they have their own seasons." As they worked side by side, Hopkins began to understand the rhythm of the harvest. Each cut required presence of mind, a connection to the earth that couldn't be fabricated or rushed. The physical labor opened a space for conversation that felt different from their previous interactions, more genuine and unguarded. "In your English world," Eli continued, using the Amish term for the outside society, "success is measured by what one achieves. Here, we measure it by what we maintain, our faith, our community, our way of life." He paused to sharpen his blade, the whetstone scraping sound punctuating his words. Samuel saw a different path. Like this wheat, he grew toward his own light. Hopkins wiped the sweat from his brow, considering Eli's words. "But surely growth doesn't always mean leaving?" he probed, thinking of his own journey from a working-class background in Wales to international stardom. "Sometimes it's about finding new depth where you're planted." The conversation shifted as Hannah appeared at the edge of the field, carrying a basket of fresh bread and water. Her presence seemed to soften the morning's heavy topics, though Hopkins noticed how her eyes lingered on her husband's face, reading the subtle signs of his emotional weather as only a long-married partner could. As they broke for a brief rest, Hopkins found himself drawn to the complexity of the Zook family's story. How did Hannah balance her love for both husband and son? What private conversations had these fields witnessed between father and child before Samuel's departure? The why? Questions multiplied like the wheat seeds scattered by the wind. "Your son helps people now," Hopkins offered carefully, accepting a piece of Hannah's bread. "Different from farming, but perhaps not so different in essence?" He watched as something shifted in Eli's expression, pride wrestling with principle, love grappling with loss. Hannah's hand found its way to Eli's shoulder, a gesture so natural, it seemed part of their shared breathing. "The English have a saying about reaping what you sow," she said, her words carrying multiple meanings. "But they forget that sometimes the harvest looks different from what was planted." The work continued through the morning, the physical demands creating a meditation of sorts. Hopkins discovered that each swing of the scythe could be a question, or an answer. Each sheaf of wheat bound could represent a choice made or a path taken. The actor had come to study Amish life for a role, but found himself instead exploring the universal struggles of fathers and sons, tradition and change, love and letting go. Between the rows of wheat, Hopkins began to understand that this field was more than just a place of labor. It was where Eli Zook worked out his deepest questions, where the physical act of harvesting allowed space for the heart to process its own complex yield. The morning's work revealed that sometimes the most profound dialogues happen not in words, but in the shared rhythm of meaningful work, in the simple act of walking together through rows of ripening wheat. As evening settled over the Zook farmhouse, Hannah's fingers traced the worn edges of an envelope she had kept hidden in her apron pocket throughout the day. The paper, creased from countless readings, contained Samuel's words that had never reached Eli's ears. After watching Anthony Hopkins and her husband forge a unique bond over the past days, she felt the time had finally come to share this piece of her son's heart. Hannah found Anthony alone in the kitchen, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as he gazed out the window at Eli tending to the evening chores. The actor's presence had brought an unexpected warmth to their home, and more importantly, had begun to soften the rigid walls her husband had built around his pain. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mr. Hopkins? Hannah spoke softly, pulling out a chair across from him. There's something I believe you should read. She carefully unfolded the letter, smoothing its creases with gentle reverence. Samuel wrote this 3 years ago, just before he left for medical school. Eli has never read it. His pride wouldn't allow it then. Anthony accepted the letter with quiet understanding, noting the careful penmanship that spoke of someone trying to pour their entire heart into each carefully chosen word. As he began to read, Samuel's voice emerged through the carefully crafted sentences. Dear Father, I've written this letter 100 times in my head, but the words never seem adequate to express what lies in my heart. How does a son tell his father that following his dreams means leaving behind everything that father has built? The weight of this decision has kept me awake for countless nights. You taught me that honest work honors God, that simplicity brings us closer to what matters most. These lessons will forever be part of who I am. But you also taught me something you may not have intended. You showed me the profound impact one person can have on others through their life's work. I watched you heal sick animals, counsel troubled neighbors, and serve as a pillar of strength for our community. Perhaps it was those very examples that planted the seed of medicine in my heart. When I close my eyes and pray for guidance, I see myself healing people, using the gifts God gave me to ease suffering. Is this not also a way to honor Him? To serve others as you have taught me? I know my choice brings you pain, and that burden will always be heavy in my heart. But I must believe that the same God who gave you the wisdom to be a leader in our community has given me this calling to medicine. My path may look different from what you envisioned, but the values you and Mother instilled remain my foundation. Anthony paused in his reading, glancing up at Hannah, who sat with quiet tears tracking down her cheeks. The letter continued, each word a careful bridge attempting to span the chasm between two worlds. Mother tells me you still sit in my room some evenings, looking at the wooden doctor's kit you made me when I was 7. Do you remember how I would treat the barn cats, wrapping their perfectly healthy paws in strips of old sheets? You laughed then, calling me your little healer. That little boy still lives inside me, Father, still seeking your approval, still hoping to make you proud. I'm not leaving our faith or our family. I'm following the path I believe God has set before me. The world may be different outside our community, but the truth and love you've taught me will always be my compass. Can you find it in your heart to understand that sometimes honoring our parents means having the courage to become who we're meant to be, even when that path diverges from theirs? With eternal love and respect, Samuel. The kitchen fell silent save for the distant sounds of horses in the barn and the gentle tick of the wall clock. Anthony carefully refolded the letter, his actor's training failing him as he struggled to mask his own emotional response to Samuel's words. Hannah, why share this with me now? He asked, though perhaps he already knew the answer. Hannah's eyes drifted to the window where Eli's silhouette moved through the gathering dusk. Because you've helped my husband remember how to listen with his heart these past days. Maybe now, he's ready to hear his son's words without the barrier of his pride standing in the way. The question hung unspoken between them. Could this letter, finally shared, help bridge the gap between father and son? And would Anthony's unexpected role in their family's story help heal wounds that had been left to fester for far too long? A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-baked bread through the Zook farmhouse kitchen as Hannah set down a modest spread of homemade fare. Anthony Hopkins, accustomed to Michelin-starred restaurants and elaborate Hollywood catering, found himself drawn to the simple authenticity of the meal before him. The wooden table, worn smooth by generations of daily use, held platters of hand-churned butter, thick slices of ham, and garden vegetables that had been harvested that very morning. The weight of Samuel's letter still hung in the air, its words echoing in their minds as they gathered around the table. Eli's weathered hands remained clasped longer than usual during the blessing, his whispered prayer carrying an extra measure of emotion that didn't go unnoticed by those present. How many meals had passed at this very table, Hopkins wondered, while the empty chair that should have held Samuel stood as a silent reminder of absence. Hannah moved with practiced efficiency, her actions speaking of decades spent nurturing her family through the simple act of breaking bread together. She passed the dishes with quiet grace, her eyes occasionally meeting Eli's with unspoken understanding. The contrast between this scene and Hopkins' usual dining experiences struck him profoundly. Where were the hovering waiters, the elaborate wine pairings, the carefully curated ambiance? Here, authenticity needed no curation. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on lighter subjects as if by mutual agreement to let the morning's emotional revelations settle. Eli spoke of the season's crops, his deep knowledge of the land evident in every observation. Hannah shared stories of her prized honeybees, describing how their habits had changed with the warming spring air. Hopkins found himself completely engaged, discovering that the wisdom shared over this simple meal carried more weight than countless Hollywood power lunches. As they ate, Hopkins observed the subtle dynamics between husband and wife. How did they maintain such harmony while navigating the complex waters of their son's departure? The answer seemed to lie in their quiet strength, their ability to face challenges together while holding fast to their core beliefs. The actor had portrayed countless relationships on screen, but here was something rarely captured by any script, a love tempered by time and trial, yet undiminished. The meal itself became a lesson in mindfulness. Hopkins noticed how each bite was appreciated, how conversation paused naturally to savor particularly delicious morsels. No phones interrupted the flow of discussion, no urgent messages demanded attention. When was the last time he had experienced such presence in a meal? The simplicity of the food somehow enhanced its flavor. Fresh butter on warm bread, vegetables that carried the essence of the earth they'd grown in. Hannah's quiet observation of their guest didn't go unnoticed. She seemed to take pleasure in watching Hopkins discover the satisfaction of their uncomplicated fare. Was she remembering similar meals with Samuel? Did she see in Hopkins' appreciation something that reminded her of her son's first steps into the outside world? The questions remained unasked, but their presence added depth to the comfortable silence that occasionally settled over the table. Eli's demeanor had softened since the morning's emotional reading of Samuel's letter. As he passed the pitcher of fresh milk, his movements carried less of the tension that had marked their earlier interactions. Perhaps the act of sharing a meal, this most basic of human connections, helped bridge the gap between their different worlds. How many important conversations, Hopkins wondered, had taken place around this very table? The meal drew to a close naturally, without the artificial punctuation of a check being presented or a maitre d' hovering nearby. Hannah began to clear the dishes with the same quiet efficiency with which she had served them, waving off Hopkins' attempts to assist. "You are our guest," she said simply, but her smile carried warmth that transcended their cultural differences. As they prepared to return to their afternoon tasks, Hopkins found himself reluctant to leave the peaceful atmosphere of the kitchen. The simple meal had offered more than physical nourishment. It had provided a glimpse into the heart of Amish life, where community, family, and faith intertwined seamlessly with daily existence. How could he capture this essence in his portrayal? What elements of this experience would translate to the screen? Dark clouds rolled across the Lancaster County sky as Anthony Hopkins helped Eli Zook secure the last of the morning's harvest. The air grew thick with humidity, carrying the unmistakable scent of impending rain. Hannah's voice cut through the growing wind, calling from the farmhouse porch with urgency that drew both men's attention. "The radio's warning of a severe thunderstorm," she announced, her voice carrying hints of concern beneath its practical tone. "Samuel just called from the hospital. They're seeing it on their weather radar. Eli's weathered face turned skyward, reading nature's signs with the expertise of generations. "We've got minutes, not hours," he declared, already moving with purpose toward the barn. "Anthony, we'll need to secure the livestock and equipment." The contrast between Hopkins' current situation and his usual lifestyle couldn't have been more stark. Rather than retreating to a climate-controlled trailer between scenes, he found himself racing against nature alongside the Zook family. Wind picked up, whipping his shirt against his chest as he followed Eli's lead. Inside the barn, the animals grew restless, sensing the approaching storm. Eli directed Hopkins with the efficiency of someone who had weathered countless such emergencies. "The young calves need moving to the inner stalls," he instructed, already gathering rope and additional supplies. "Hannah will help with the chickens." Working together, they moved with increasing urgency as thunder began to rumble overhead. Hopkins found himself learning yet another aspect of farm life: crisis management without modern conveniences. The physical demands felt different from memorizing lines or performing choreographed scenes. This was raw, immediate, and consequential. Hannah appeared in the barn doorway, her apron fluttering in the strengthening gusts. "The chicken coop is secured," she reported, immediately moving to help with the remaining tasks. "But the western fence might not hold if the wind gets much stronger." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as they finished with the animals. Eli's expression grew more concerned as he assessed their situation. "The creek could flood if this is as bad as it sounds," he said, leading them toward the equipment shed. "We need to move the tractor to higher ground." Hopkins observed the seamless way the Zooks worked together, decades of shared experience evident in their wordless coordination. Despite the emergency, their movements remained deliberate and purposeful, wasting no energy on panic or confusion. This was not a performance, it was life, raw and unscripted. The storm intensified as they secured the last of the equipment. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder that made the barn's timbers creak. Through the increasing downpour, Hopkins caught sight of an approaching vehicle's headlights. Samuel's car appeared through the curtain of rain, and he emerged running toward them, medical bag in hand. "The hospital released me early," he called, out, joining their efforts without hesitation. "The weather service is saying this could be severe." The family dynamic shifted with Samuel's arrival, years of tension momentarily set aside in the face of immediate need. Eli accepted his son's help without comment, their shared understanding of farm operations transcending their differences. Hopkins watched as father and son worked side by side, their movements mirroring each other in ways neither might have noticed. As the storm reached its full fury, the group retreated to the farmhouse's shelter. Water coursed down the windows, while wind howled through the eaves, nature's power providing a humbling reminder of human vulnerability. Inside, Hannah lit kerosene lamps in preparation for potential power loss, their warm glow creating islands of light in the growing darkness. The contrast between this moment and Hopkins's usual world struck him profoundly. Here, in this farmhouse, kitchen celebrity status meant nothing against nature's fury. What mattered was community, family, and the ability to work together when challenges arose. The storm had stripped away pretense, leaving only the essential truth of human interdependence. Thunder continued to shake the house as Hannah prepared hot coffee, her practical response to crisis reflecting generations of rural wisdom. The group gathered around the kitchen table, their earlier roles of host and guest, father and son, Amish and English, temporarily suspended by shared circumstance. Through the window, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes, revealing glimpses of their morning's work standing firm against the elements. The barn remained solid, the animals secure, the equipment protected, all because of their combined efforts. In those moments of waiting out the storm, Hopkins realized he was experiencing something his years in Hollywood had never provided: the raw authenticity of facing nature's challenges as part of a community, rather than an individual. The storm raged on, but within the farmhouse's walls a different kind of energy emerged. It wasn't the artificial excitement of a film set or the manufactured drama of a script. Instead, it was the quiet strength of people united by circumstance, each contributing their part to weather the storm together. Thunder still rumbled in the distance as Samuel Zook's car pulled into the muddy driveway of his childhood home. The aftermath of the storm had left the familiar landscape transformed. Puddles dotted the yard, and fallen branches littered the usually pristine farmland. Through the raindrops on his windshield, Samuel could make out 4 figures moving about the barn, working in synchronized efficiency to secure the last of the storm preparations. Anthony Hopkins stood alongside Samuel's father Eli, their shoulders nearly touching as they pushed against the heavy barn door. The sight gave Samuel pause. What was Sir Anthony Hopkins doing on his family's farm? The question momentarily distracted him from the anxiety that had been building during his 3-hour drive from Philadelphia. Hannah Zook was the first to notice her son's arrival. She stopped mid-motion, her hand frozen in the act of gathering fallen straw, and for a moment time seemed to suspend itself. The mother's face transformed with joy, though concern quickly followed as she realized the unexpected nature of this visit. Samuel rarely came home without advance notice, and never during harvest season. Eli's reaction proved more complex. His movements became deliberately measured as he finished securing the barn door, his expression unreadable behind his traditional beard. The distance between father and son seemed to stretch beyond the physical space of the rain-soaked yard, filled with unspoken words and divergent choices. Anthony observed the subtle shift in dynamics with keen interest. Having spent the past weeks immersed in the Zook family's world, he'd heard pieces of Samuel's story, the brilliant young man who chose medical school over the Amish way of life. The tension in the air was palpable, reminding Anthony of the complex relationships he'd portrayed throughout his career, though this drama was decidedly real. Hannah broke the spell first, hurrying toward her son with open arms, her practical shoes splashing through puddles. "Samuel, what a wonderful surprise." Her voice carried the warmth of maternal love, yet held a question in its tone. Something had brought her son home unannounced, and maternal instinct told her it wasn't merely a social call. Samuel emerged from his car, his modern attire, a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, creating a stark contrast against the traditional clothing of his parents. He embraced his mother, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh bread and herbs that always seemed to surround her. "Ma'am," he said softly, the Pennsylvania Dutch term of endearment falling naturally from his lips despite years in the English world. Eli approached more slowly, his footsteps heavy with the weight of their complicated relationship. The father and son regarded each other with a mixture of love and wariness, like 2 people speaking different dialects of the same language. "Samuel," Eli acknowledged, extending his hand in a gesture that bridged the gap between Amish tradition and modern greeting. Anthony hung back, understanding the delicacy of the moment, but Samuel's eyes found him with obvious curiosity. The young doctor's medical training showed in his observant gaze as he took in the scene before him. The famous actor's presence, the storm damage, the subtle interplay between his parents. Hannah, ever the peacekeeper, quickly took charge of the situation. "Come inside, all of you. The rain may have stopped, but there's a chill in the air." She gestured toward the farmhouse where warm light spilled from the windows, promising comfort and perhaps reconciliation. As they moved toward the house, Anthony noticed how Samuel's steps faltered slightly, as if carrying a burden heavier than the small overnight bag slung over his shoulder. What had brought this young man home? The question hung in the air, mixing with the petrichor rising from the rain-soaked earth. Inside, the farmhouse kitchen welcomed them with the aroma of fresh coffee and something sweet baking in the oven, Hannah's instinctive response to any situation that required careful handling. The contrast between Samuel's modern presence and the traditional setting of his childhood home created an almost tangible tension, like 2 worlds colliding in the confined space of the familiar kitchen. Who would be the first to break the silence that had settled over them? What urgent matter had driven Samuel to seek out his family unannounced? The answers waited to unfold, as complex and unpredictable as the storm that had just passed through, leaving everything changed in its wake. The evening air hung heavy with unspoken words as Anthony Hopkins observed the tense atmosphere in the Zook farmhouse. Samuel's unexpected arrival had stirred something deep within the household's carefully maintained peace, like a stone disturbing still waters. Through the kitchen window, Hopkins watched as Eli and Samuel walked toward the barn, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. What conversations transpired between fathers and sons when worlds collided? How did one bridge the gap between tradition and progress, between the old ways and the new? These questions weighed on Hopkins's mind as he noticed Hannah's worried glances toward the barn, her hands mechanically continuing their work with the evening meal preparation. The relationship between Eli and Samuel embodied a complexity that transcended typical father-son dynamics. Their footsteps had left different imprints, one deeply rooted in the soil of their ancestors, the other venturing into the modern world of medicine. Hopkins found himself drawn to their story, recognizing the universal struggle between honoring one's heritage and pursuing personal dreams. Through the barn's weather-worn boards, fragments of their conversation drifted across the yard. Samuel's voice carried the measured tone of his medical training, while Eli's responses held the steady wisdom of generations. "The community needs you, Samuel." Eli's words emerged clearly, carrying both authority and plea. "Your skills could help our people." Samuel's response revealed the burden he carried. "I can help more people in the city, Father. The hospital has resources we could never have here." The words weren't meant to wound, but Hopkins could see Eli's slight flinch visible even from a distance. The gap between their worlds seemed to widen with each exchange. Hannah's presence at Hopkins's side startled him from his observations. "They are both stubborn men," she offered quietly, her eyes fixed on the barn, "each believing their path is the right one." Her insight carried the weight of years watching this divide grow between her husband and son. The conversation in the barn shifted, becoming more personal. "When you left," Eli's voice cracked slightly, "it wasn't just the community you turned from." The raw emotion in his words made Hopkins feel like an intruder, yet he couldn't look away from this intimate moment between father and son. Samuel stepped closer to his father, his modern clothes a stark contrast to Eli's traditional attire. "I never turned from you, Father. I turned toward something else." The distinction was subtle but significant, carrying years of explanation in a single sentence. Hopkins watched as Eli's shoulders softened slightly, the first sign of understanding he'd shown since Samuel's arrival. What thoughts crossed the older man's mind as he faced his son's choices? How did one reconcile love for a child with disappointment in their decisions? The tension between tradition and progress played out before Hopkins's eyes, reminiscent of countless stories throughout human history. Yet this wasn't just any story. It was intimately personal, affecting real lives and real relationships. The actor found himself questioning his own presence in this delicate moment, wondering if his role in the Zook household had somehow contributed to bringing these issues to the surface. Hannah's quiet voice interrupted his thoughts again. "Sometimes, the hardest part of love is letting go of what we thought it should look like." Her words carried wisdom that transcended the specific situation, speaking to universal truths about family, growth, and acceptance. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Eli and Samuel emerged from the barn. Something had shifted between them. Not a complete resolution, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Their steps were more in sync as they walked back toward the house, the distance between them slightly less pronounced. Hopkins stepped back from the window, giving father and son privacy as they approached. The evening's events had revealed layers of complexity in the Zook family that went beyond the simple narrative of Amish life he'd initially expected to find. In witnessing their struggle, he'd gained insight into not just their world, but the universal challenges of family, faith, and finding one's path. What would tomorrow bring for this family caught between two worlds? How would Eli reconcile his deep-rooted traditions with his son's chosen path? These questions lingered in Hopkins' mind as the family gathered for evening meal, the tension now tempered with a fragile hope for understanding. In the soft glow of early evening, Hannah Zook stood at her kitchen window, her hands methodically working through the familiar motions of washing dishes as Anthony Hopkins sat quietly at the worn wooden table. The aftermath of Samuel's visit had left a palpable weight in the air, and Hannah's usual cheerful demeanor carried an undertone of contemplation. "Mr. Hopkins," Hannah began, her voice gentle yet firm, "there's something about Eli and Samuel that few people understand." She turned from the window, drying her hands on her apron, her eyes holding a depth of wisdom that caught Hopkins' attention. When Samuel first spoke of leaving, it wasn't just about choosing a different path. It was about Eli making the hardest choice a father could make. Hopkins leaned forward, intrigued by the shift in Hannah's typically reserved manner. What could have been so significant about Eli's choice? The question hung unspoken between them as Hannah settled into the chair across from him. "Samuel had always been different," she continued, her fingers absently tracing the wood grain of the table. "Even as a small child, he would spend hours with our English neighbors when they were sick or injured, asking questions about medicine that none of us could answer. Eli saw it before anyone else did, that spark of calling that went beyond our way of life." Hannah revealed how Samuel's interest in medicine had grown stronger with each passing year. When he was 16, a tragic accident in the community had left a young girl critically injured. Samuel had been the one to stabilize her until the English doctors arrived, and that moment had crystallized his determination to pursue medical training. "But it wasn't that simple," Hannah explained, her voice lowering as if sharing a precious secret. "For Samuel to attend medical school, he needed a proper education first. Our community school only goes through the 8th grade. Eli knew what to. Letting Samuel continue his education would mean it would set him on a path that led away from our way of life." The weight of this revelation settled over Hopkins as Hannah shared how Eli had secretly arranged for Samuel to take evening classes at the local high school, driving him there himself in direct opposition to community standards. For 3 years, Eli had risked censure from the church leaders, potential shunning, and his position as a respected elder to give his son a chance at his dream. Every night they would return late, and Eli would spend hours in prayer, torn between his duty to our ways and his love for his son, Hannah said, emotion coloring her voice. "He never told Samuel how close we came to being asked to leave the community. When the bishops finally discovered the truth, it was Eli's years of faithful service and his honest confession that saved us from formal shunning." Hopkins found himself struck by the parallel between this story and his own journey in acting, where pursuing one's passion often meant facing opposition and making difficult choices. But Eli's sacrifice went beyond personal risk. It challenged the very foundation of his beliefs and his place in the community. Hannah continued, revealing how Eli had privately sold a portion of their best farmland to help fund Samuel's initial college expenses, though he told everyone it was due to poor crop yields. The money had been given to Samuel through Hannah, allowing Eli to maintain his public stance of disapproval while secretly supporting his son's dreams. "You see, Mr. Hopkins," Hannah said, meeting his gaze directly, "when you watched them today, you saw a father struggling to accept his son's choices. But what you couldn't see was a man who had already accepted those choices years ago, who made his peace with God about helping his son leave, even while his heart broke with each step Samuel took away from our world." The revelation cast new light on Eli's complex character, helping Hopkins understand the deeper currents running beneath the farmer's stern exterior. How many fathers, he wondered, would have the courage to sacrifice their own standing, risk their community's rejection, and challenge their deepest beliefs for their child's dreams? Hannah rose from the table, moving to light a kerosene lamp as dusk settled outside. "Eli will never speak of these things himself. His way is to bear his burdens quietly, between himself and God. But I wanted you to understand, sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones we keep hidden, the sacrifices that no one else sees." The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the covered bridge spanning Miller's Creek. Anthony Hopkins stood beside Eli Zook, both men studying the structure's worn timbers and loose boards with careful consideration. The bridge, like many aspects of Amish life, told a story of time's passage and the delicate balance between preservation and progress. After Hannah's revelation about Eli's secret support of Samuel's medical education, Hopkins viewed his host through a different lens, The complexity of Eli's character, a man who maintained strict adherence to tradition while quietly enabling his son's departure from it, fascinated the actor. How many other layers existed beneath the surface of this seemingly simple farmer? The support beam here needs reinforcing, Eli explained, pointing to a weathered post. We've patched it before, but this time requires more attention. His words carried weight beyond their immediate context, echoing the careful maintenance required in all relationships, particularly those stretched between two worlds. Hopkins found himself drawing parallels between the bridge's dual purpose, connecting opposite banks while standing firmly rooted in both, and the Zook family's situation. Like the structure before them, they spanned two realms, the traditional Amish world and the modern one Samuel now inhabited. Could this physical act of repair serve a greater purpose? As they worked together, hauling new timber and securing loose planks, Hopkins recalled Hannah's words about Eli's clandestine support of Samuel. The father had created his own bridge years ago, finding ways to help his son cross into a different life while maintaining his own footing in the community he loved. Yet unlike this wooden structure, that emotional passage remained uncertain, its repairs more complex than hammer and nail could address. Other community members joined their effort throughout the day, working with the quiet efficiency Hopkins had come to admire. Young men carried tools while older ones offered guidance, their collective knowledge passed down through generations of bridge maintenance. The actor observed how Eli commanded respect without demanding it, his leadership style reflecting years of earned wisdom rather than assumed authority. The physical labor opened new channels of conversation between Hopkins and his host. Between measuring boards and testing joints, Eli shared stories of Samuel's childhood, tales of a curious boy who asked endless questions about the world beyond their farm. The pride in Eli's voice when speaking of his son's early intelligence conflicted with the pain of their current distance, creating a symphony of complex emotions that Hopkins recognized from his own life experiences. Samuel used to spend hours on this bridge, Eli mentioned while securing a crossbeam. He would watch the water below, telling us it reminded him of how everything flows forward, never staying still. The observation carried the weight of prophecy now, considering Samuel's eventual path. Hopkins considered how bridges serve as more than mere crossing points. They become witnesses to countless journeys, both physical and spiritual. How many young Amish had stood on these planks, contemplating their place between tradition and change? How many parents, like Eli and Hannah, had watched their children cross over to different lives? The work continued through the afternoon, each repair strengthening not only the physical structure but also the understanding between the English actor and his Amish host. Hopkins noticed how Eli approached each task with deliberate care, his craftsmanship reflecting the same attention he had shown while teaching farming techniques. Was this another lesson in patience and precision? As the day progressed, more community members arrived with food and encouragement. Hopkins observed the subtle interactions between families, the way they supported one another without fanfare or expectation. This bridge, he realized, represented more than a connection between physical spaces. It embodied the connections between people, between past and present, between holding on and letting go. The final hours of work revealed another layer of symbolism. Just as the bridge required both old and new materials to remain strong, perhaps the Zook family's journey required a similar blend of tradition and adaptation. Could acknowledging this help heal the gap between father and son? When they finally stepped back to survey their work, Hopkins saw satisfaction in Eli's eyes. The bridge stood stronger now, ready to serve its community for years to come. But the actor wondered about the other bridges in their lives, the ones built of understanding and acceptance, of love that spans distances both physical and philosophical. Would they prove as durable as this wooden structure before them? As dusk settled over the Lancaster countryside, Anthony Hopkins found himself drawn to the gentle rhythms of the Zook family's evening routine. The day's work had left his muscles pleasantly tired from helping repair the covered bridge, yet his mind remained alert, observing every detail of this unfamiliar ritual unfolding before him. Hannah Zook moved through their modest home with practiced grace, lighting oil lamps that cast warm pools of light across worn wooden floors. The absence of electric illumination, rather than feeling primitive, created an atmosphere of timeless serenity. How many generations had performed these same actions, Hopkins wondered, finding comfort in these ancient patterns? Eli gathered his family with a quiet authority that needed no words, just a simple nod toward their usual places. The English actor watched as they settled around the plain wooden table, noting how even their movements seemed choreographed by years of tradition. The scene before him carried none of the artificial precision he'd encountered on countless film sets, instead flowing with an organic harmony that spoke of something deeper. Hannah reached for her well-worn Bible, its pages softened by years of daily handling. The leather cover bore the subtle impressions of countless touches, marking it as more than just a book. It was a family archive of faith. Hopkins found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the intimacy of the moment, feeling both observer and participant in this daily devotion. Eli's voice, when he began to read, carried the same measured cadence that had guided Hopkins through farming tasks earlier that day. The German words of their prayer, though foreign to Hopkins' ears, resonated with a musical quality that transcended literal understanding. What secrets lay within these ancient phrases, passed down through generations of believers? The actor's thoughts drifted to Samuel, the absent son whose modern life as a doctor created an invisible presence in the room. How many such evening prayers had included petitions for their child who chose a different path? Hopkins caught a fleeting expression cross Hannah's face. Was it pride or worry that softened her features as the prayer continued? In the gentle silence between verses, Hopkins became aware of his own breathing falling into rhythm with the family's collective pause. The theatrical training that had taught him to command attention now served to help him disappear into the background, becoming part of the scene rather than its focus. What would his colleagues in Hollywood make of this moment, he wondered, where the most compelling drama lay in perfect stillness? As Eli turned another page, the lamplight caught the silver in his beard, reminding Hopkins of their conversation about time's passage while working on the bridge. The Amish patriarch had spoken of changes within tradition, of holding fast while bending like wheat in the wind. Now, watching him lead his family in prayer, Hopkins began to understand the deeper meaning behind those words. Hannah's quiet responses carried undertones of strength that belied her gentle demeanor. She was more than just a supportive wife. She formed an essential foundation for this family's spiritual framework. How did she balance her love for Samuel's chosen path with her commitment to their traditional life? The question lingered in Hopkins' mind as the prayer continued. The simple act of gathering for evening devotions revealed layers of complexity in the Zook family dynamics. Each person brought their own understanding, their private hopes and concerns, yet united in this shared moment of faith. Hopkins found himself wondering about his own spiritual journey, shaped by years of portraying characters seeking meaning in their lives. The prayer drew to a close, with the same unhurried grace that marked its beginning. No one rushed to move away from the table. The transition from formal prayer to comfortable family conversation happened naturally, like a stream finding its course. Hopkins noticed how Eli's hand remained near Hannah's on the table, a subtle gesture of connection that spoke volumes about their partnership. As the evening settled around them, Hopkins realized he had witnessed something far more significant than a simple religious observance. In this quiet room, illuminated by lamplight and faith, he had seen a family's heart revealed through their most intimate traditions. What revelations awaited in the days ahead as he continued to share in their lives? The questions lingered in his mind as the family dispersed to their evening tasks, leaving him to contemplate the unexpected peace he had found in their ritual. Perhaps some answers lay not in words but in the silent spaces between them, in the gentle flow of life guided by centuries of faithful practice. Under the vast Pennsylvania sky, Anthony Hopkins sat alone on the Zook's wooden porch, his thoughts as restless as the fireflies dancing in the darkness before him. The evening prayers he'd witnessed earlier had stirred something deep within him, a longing he couldn't quite name, yet felt with increasing intensity as each day passed on the Amish farm. What was it about this simple life that made his own carefully constructed world seem suddenly hollow? The question nagged at him as he recalled Hannah's serene expression during prayers, the way Eli's strong hands had clasped together with unwavering faith, and the empty chair that silently spoke of Samuel's absence. In Hollywood, Hopkins had portrayed countless characters, delved into numerous psyches, but here he found himself struggling to understand his own. The roles, the accolades, the carefully crafted public persona. How much of it was truly him? The silence of the countryside seemed to demand honesty from him in a way the clamor of Los Angeles never had. His thoughts drifted to earlier conversations with Eli about authenticity and craft. The master furniture maker's words about letting the wood speak its truth had struck a chord. In his decades of acting, had he been forcing performances, like trying to bend stubborn wood against its grain? Or had he been listening, truly listening, to the authentic voice within? The relationship between Eli and Samuel weighed heavily on his mind. Their story reflected countless tales he'd performed on screen. Fathers and sons, tradition versus progress, the price of following one's dreams. Yet here it was, raw and real, playing out in the lives of people he'd come to care about deeply. He thought about his own father, long gone now, and the words they'd never spoken. A soft creak of floorboards announced Hannah's presence before she appeared with 2 steaming mugs of tea. Without a word, she handed one to Hopkins and settled into the chair beside him. Her quiet understanding reminded him of the best directors he'd worked with, those who knew when to speak and when silence told the better story. Samuel's room still has his childhood drawings on the walls, Hannah shared softly, her voice carrying no judgment, only a mother's enduring love. Eli won't let me take them down, though he'd never admit why. She paused, blowing gently on her tea. Sometimes the hardest roles we play are the ones life casts us in. Her words resonated with Hopkins' own experiences of balancing public expectations with private truths. How many times had he hidden behind characters to avoid facing his own story? The Amish way of life stripped away those protective layers, demanding authenticity that both terrified and attracted him. The evening's prayers had highlighted the stark contrast between this world and his own. In Hollywood, spirituality often became a performance, another costume to don when convenient. But here, faith wove through every action, every choice as natural as breathing. What would it be like, he wondered, to live with such certainty? His gaze fell on Eli's workshop, barely visible in the moonlight. Tomorrow, they would continue their lessons, but Hopkins now understood that he was learning far more than furniture making. Through Eli's patient guidance, he was discovering something about craftsmanship that transcended both woodworking and acting, the art of being true to one's nature. Hannah's quiet presence beside him offered its own kind of wisdom. In dissecting her, he saw the strength that came from choosing one's path and walking it with conviction. She had chosen this life, embraced its limitations and freedoms, while still finding ways to bridge the gap between her world and her son's chosen path. The night air carried the distant sound of horses in their stables, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the whisper of cornstalk swaying in the breeze. These simple sounds painted a picture as vivid as any Hollywood soundtrack, yet infinitely more real. How many scenes had he filmed that attempted to capture this kind of moment? How many times had artifice tried to replicate what nature offered freely? The questions multiplied in his mind, each one leading to another, like the branching grain patterns Eli had shown him in a piece of cherry wood that afternoon. What patterns lay hidden in his own life, waiting to be revealed by the right tools, the proper attention? And what would he discover about himself in this place where pretense held no value? In the stillness of the Lancaster County evening, Anthony Hopkins sat across from Eli Zook in the farmhouse's modest kitchen, the oil lamp between them casting dancing shadows on the weathered walls. The conversation had meandered through various topics until a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the occasional distant whinny of horses in the barn. "There's something that's been weighing on my heart," Eli began, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of Hannah's chamomile tea. something I've never shared with anyone, not even Hannah. His voice carried the weight of years of unspoken thoughts, drawing Hopkins deeper into the moment. Hopkins leaned forward slightly, recognizing the gravity in Eli's tone. The veteran actor had heard countless confessions throughout his career, both on and off screen. But something about Eli's demeanor suggested this would be different. This wasn't a rehearsed scene or a dramatic monologue. This was raw truth preparing to emerge. When Samuel first told me he wanted to leave the community to become a doctor, I didn't just disapprove. I was afraid, Eli continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen window. Not afraid of him leaving the faith, as everyone assumed. I was afraid because I saw myself in him. The revelation hung in the air between them. Hopkins remained silent, understanding that some moments require nothing more than a willing listener. Eli's fingers traced the rim of his cup, a nervous gesture that betrayed his usual composed demeanor. In my youth, before I joined the church, I had dreams too. I wanted to build things, not just barns and furniture, but buildings that would touch the sky. A faint smile crossed Eli's face as he spoke of his long-buried ambitions. I had sketches hidden away in my father's barn, drawings of structures that would have made our elders shake their heads in disapproval. The confession continued to unfold as Eli shared how he'd once secretly corresponded with an architecture school in Philadelphia. They had shown interest in his natural talent, offering him a chance at a different life. But duty, tradition, and the fear of disappointing his family had kept him rooted in the community. When I see Samuel living the life he chose, it stirs something in me that I thought I had buried decades ago, Eli admitted. Don't misunderstand. I love our way of life, I love Hannah, and I'm grateful for everything God has blessed me with. But sometimes late at night I wonder about the buildings that were never built. Hopkins found himself drawn into Eli's story, recognizing the universal struggle between personal dreams and familial obligations. How many others carried similar untold stories? How many dreams lay dormant beneath the surface of seemingly content lives? The hardest part wasn't giving up. My own dreams, Eli continued, his voice growing softer. It was almost destroying Samuel's. When he first told us about medical school, I reacted with anger, not because I disapproved, but because I envied his courage to do what I never dared. The confession took an unexpected turn, as Eli revealed how he'd secretly begun supporting Samuel's medical education through an arrangement with an English friend who helped him sell his woodwork in Philadelphia. This secret support was his way of ensuring his son wouldn't have to choose between his dreams and his family's love. I've never told Samuel about this, Eli confided. Perhaps I should, but pride is a stubborn thing, even among the plain folk. Sometimes I think about telling him everything, about the architecture, about the secret support. But then I wonder if understanding comes better with time, like the seasoning of wood. Hopkins absorbed the weight of Eli's confession, understanding that he'd been entrusted with something precious. The story revealed layers of complexity in the seemingly simple Amish life he'd been observing. It challenged his preconceptions about choice, sacrifice, and the quiet courage it takes to support others' dreams while letting go of one's own. What would you have built? Hopkins asked softly, offering Eli a chance to share the visions he'd kept locked away for so long. The question opened a door to a conversation that would continue well into the night, as two men from vastly different worlds found common ground in the universal language of dreams, deferred, and hopes renewed. The pre-dawn hours crept across Lancaster County as Anthony Hopkins stood at the window of his modest guest room in the Zook farmhouse. Sleep had proven elusive after his profound conversation with Eli the previous evening, the old Amish man's words echoing in his mind like a haunting melody. Through the window's wavy glass, Hopkins watched the first hints of purple streak across the eastern sky. The conversation with Eli had stripped away layers of pretense, revealing raw truths about fathers and sons, tradition and progress, love and loss. How many fathers and sons, Hopkins wondered, found themselves separated not by distance but by the choices they made? The actor's thoughts drifted to his own career path, the decisions that had led him from Wales to Hollywood. Had his pursuit of acting created similar rifts? The parallel between his life and Samuel's journey from the Amish world to modern medicine struck him with newfound clarity. Both had followed their calling, despite the cost to family relationships. A rooster's crow pierced the morning silence, followed by the subtle sounds of the farm awakening. Hopkins could hear Hannah's footsteps downstairs, the quiet efficiency of her morning routine a testament to years of practiced discipline. The aroma of fresh coffee wafted upward, mingling with the crisp morning air that seeped through the window frame. As the sun began its ascent, casting long shadows across the surrounding fields, Hopkins reflected on Eli's confession from the night before. The Amish man's struggle between maintaining tradition and supporting his son's dreams resonated deeply. Was there not something universal in that tension between holding on and letting go? The farmland gradually emerged from darkness, each ray of sunlight revealing another layer of the landscape. Hopkins observed how the light transformed everything it touched, much like how understanding could illuminate the darkest corners of human relationships. The barn's weathered boards took on a golden hue, while dew-laden grass sparkled like scattered diamonds. In this moment of solitude, Hopkins recognized that his role in the upcoming film had evolved into something far more significant than mere character research. He had become an unexpected bridge between worlds, a witness to the complex dynamics of faith, family, and forgiveness. The story he would tell through his performance now carried the weight of real lives, real struggles, and real love. The sound of a horse and buggy approaching drew Hopkins's attention to the road. The steady clip-clop rhythm reminded him of how time moved differently here, measured not in digital minutes but in natural cycles and daily rituals. Who was making their way along the road so early, and what stories did they carry? Below, the kitchen door opened and closed as Eli stepped out. Into the morning air, Hopkins watched as the Amish man paused, lifting his face to the sky in what appeared to be silent prayer. What words passed between this man and his God in these private moments? How did faith sustain him through the challenges of losing his son to the English world? The growing light revealed more details of the farm, the neat rows of the vegetable garden, the carefully maintained fences, the orderly woodpile against the barn. Each element spoke of Eli and Hannah's dedication to their way of life, yet also highlighted the absence of their son, who had chosen a different path. Hopkins found himself contemplating the nature of adaptation and change. The Amish were often viewed as resistant to progress, yet here was Eli, wrestling with modern challenges while holding fast to his core beliefs. Was there not wisdom in this balance between preservation and growth? The sun now hung fully above the horizon, its warm light flooding the room. Hopkins felt a subtle shift within himself, as if the morning's illumination had reached beyond the physical world to touch something deeper. His role as an actor had always been to bridge the gap between audience and story, but now he understood that some stories carried obligations beyond performance. A gentle knock at his door interrupted his reverie. Hannah's voice called softly, announcing breakfast would be ready soon. Hopkins turned from the window, the morning's insights settling into his consciousness like seeds finding fertile soil. How would these revelations shape not only his portrayal of an Amish father, but his understanding of the human heart's capacity for growth and change? The morning light had brought more than just a new day. It had delivered clarity. As Hopkins prepared to join the Zooks for breakfast, he carried with him a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance between holding on to what matters and knowing when to let go. What other lessons awaited him in the days ahead? As dawn's early light faded into morning, Anthony Hopkins stood in the Zook's kitchen, warming his hands around a steaming mug of coffee. The familiar aroma mingled with the scent of fresh-baked bread, a daily ritual Hannah had maintained for decades. Through the window he observed Eli in his workshop, hunched over his workbench with the same dedication he brought to every task. What drew Hopkins' attention wasn't just Eli's presence in the workshop, but the unusual timing. Typically, at this hour, Eli would be tending to the morning farm duties. Yet there he was, focused intently on something Hopkins couldn't quite discern from his vantage point. The actor's curiosity piqued when Hannah caught him watching and offered a knowing smile. He's been in there since before sunrise, Hannah shared, her voice carrying a hint of secretive joy. When Eli gets an idea in his head, there's no stopping him until it's complete. She busied herself with the morning dishes, but her periodic glances toward the workshop betrayed her own anticipation. The morning progressed with an air of quiet expectancy. Hopkins helped Hannah with various household tasks. Their comfortable silence punctuated by occasional conversations about family, tradition, and the simple pleasures of life. Through these interactions, Hopkins had begun to understand the deep wells of wisdom that existed within the Amish community's seemingly simple lifestyle. Around mid-morning, Eli's workshop door creaked open. He emerged carrying something wrapped in a simple cloth, his weathered hands cradling it with notable care. Hopkins noticed a few fresh wood shavings clinging to Eli's beard and apron, testament to his morning's labor. "Anthony," Eli called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Might I have a word?" Hopkins made his way to the workshop where the lingering scent of freshly worked wood hung in the air. Tools lay precisely arranged on Eli's workbench, each one speaking to years of careful use and maintenance. The scene reminded Hopkins of his own father's workshop from his childhood in Wales, triggering a rush of unexpected emotion. "During your stay with us," Eli began, his hand still holding the wrapped object, "you've shown a genuine desire to understand our ways, not just to observe but to learn." He paused, choosing his words with characteristic thoughtfulness. "It reminds me of Samuel in a way. Different path, same honest heart." The mention of Samuel brought a subtle shift in the workshop's atmosphere. Hopkins had noticed how Eli's expression always softened when speaking of his son, despite the complexity of their relationship. It was a testament to how love could bridge even the widest of gaps. "In our community, we believe that true gifts come from the hands and heart," Eli continued, beginning to unwrap the cloth. "Each piece of wood has its own story, its own character, much like people, wouldn't you say?" As the cloth fell away, it revealed a meticulously carved wooden box. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with intricate patterns flowing across its surface like frozen music. Hopkins recognized motifs he'd seen in Amish quilts, but there was something more personal in the design, something that spoke to his own journey. "The wood is from a maple tree that fell during last year's storm," Eli explained, running his finger along one of the patterns. "We could have used it for firewood, but sometimes the greatest beauty comes from what others might consider broken or lost." The symbolism wasn't lost on Hopkins. Throughout his career, he'd portrayed characters who found strength in their brokenness, wisdom in their wounds. But here, in this simple workshop, those theatrical transformations felt distant compared to the authentic evolution he'd experienced during his stay with the Zooks. Eli handed the box to Hopkins, who received it with the reverence it deserved. The wood felt warm against his palms, alive with the energy of its maker's dedication. As he examined the detailed workmanship, Hopkins discovered subtle elements that connected to conversations he'd shared with Eli over the past weeks, a pattern that echoed their discussion about life's circular nature, a motif that recalled their talk about finding peace in silence. "A gift should serve both the heart and the hands," Eli said, watching Hopkins explore the box's details. "Perhaps this can hold your scripts, or letters from home, or whatever else you deem worthy of safekeeping." The gesture transcended the physical object itself. In this box, Hopkins recognized the culmination of their shared journey. Student and teacher, outsider and insider, each learning from the other in unexpected ways. But what touched him most was the realization that through this gift, Eli had acknowledged him not just as a visitor or an actor, but as someone worthy of carrying a piece of their world forward. As dawn painted the Lancaster County sky in gentle brushstrokes of pink and gold, Anthony Hopkins stood on the Zook's front porch, his heart heavy with the weight of farewell. The wooden carving Eli had gifted him the previous evening pressed against his palm, its smooth surface a testament to the craftsman's dedication and skill. How could a simple piece of wood carry such profound meaning? The screen door creaked, open behind him, and Hannah Zook emerged with a basket covered in a checkered cloth. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the crisp morning air. "For your journey?" she said softly, pressing the basket into his hands. though I suspect the real nourishment you'll take with you isn't something that can be wrapped in cloth." Hopkins accepted the basket, noting how Hannah's eyes held the same gentle wisdom he'd come to associate with her husband. During his stay, he'd witnessed the subtle dance of their partnership, the way they moved through their days in perfect synchronization, each anticipating the other's needs without a word spoken. Their love manifested not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments of shared purpose. Eli appeared in the doorway, his weathered face bearing the same stoic expression Hopkins had first encountered weeks ago. Yet something had shifted between them, an understanding that transcended their different worlds. The older man extended his hand, and Hopkins grasped it firmly, remembering their first awkward handshake. What had begun as a professional obligation had evolved into something far more meaningful. "You've taught me more than I could have imagined," Hopkins said, his voice thick with emotion. "About simplicity, about authenticity." He paused, searching for the right words. "About the power of silence." Eli's eyes crinkled at the corners, a rare smile emerging. "Perhaps we have learned from each other, friend. Sometimes it takes an outsider's eyes to help us see our own truth more clearly." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road, where Samuel Zook's buggy appeared through the morning mist. He had insisted on driving Hopkins to the station himself, a gesture that spoke volumes about the bridges being rebuilt between father and son. Would this morning mark a new chapter in their relationship? As Samuel brought the buggy to a stop, Hopkins noticed the subtle exchange of glances between father and son. The tension that had marked their earlier interactions had softened, replaced by something tentative, yet hopeful. Hannah stepped forward to embrace her son, whispering something in his ear that brought a smile to his face. Hopkins gathered his belongings, carefully tucking the wooden carving into his jacket pocket, close to his heart. The weight of his Hollywood existence seemed distant now, as if belonging to another life entirely. How would he carry these lessons back to a world of bright lights and carefully crafted illusions? "The simplest truths are often the hardest to grasp," Eli said, as if reading his thoughts. "But once understood, they cannot be forgotten." Samuel helped load Hopkins' bags into the buggy, then took his place at the reins. The moment of departure had arrived, yet Hopkins found himself lingering, trying to memorize every detail of the scene before him. The weathered wood of the porch, the morning glory vines climbing the posts, the steady presence of Eli and Hannah standing side by side. "Your role," Eli added, his voice carrying the weight of final wisdom, "is not to become Amish, but to understand why we choose this life. Take that understanding back to your world. Let it inform your art." Hopkins nodded, unable to speak. How could he explain that his initial quest for artistic authenticity had led him to something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of himself? As he climbed into the buggy beside Samuel, Hannah called out, "Remember, you'll always have a home here." The simple statement carried the weight of true hospitality, of bonds formed beyond the boundaries of culture and custom. The buggy began to move, and Hopkins turned for one last look at the farm that had become his sanctuary. Eli and Hannah stood framed in the morning light, their figures growing smaller, but their impact on his life only expanding. The wooden carving, pressed against his chest, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the horse's hooves, a tangible reminder of the intangible gifts he'd received. What would he tell his colleagues back in Hollywood about his time with the Zooks? How could he possibly convey the profound simplicity of their lives, the depth of their convictions, the quiet strength of their faith? Perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Some truths can only be lived, never explained. As Anthony Hopkins's private car wound through the familiar streets of Beverly Hills, the stark contrast between his current surroundings and the simple, Amish farmland he'd left behind stirred something deep within him. The manicured lawns and pristine mansions, once symbols of success, now felt oddly hollow after his time with the Zook family. His driver caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "Welcome back to civilization, Mr. Hopkins," he said with a knowing smile. But was this really civilization? The question lingered as Hopkins recalled Eli's weathered hands working the soil, Hannah's quiet strength in the kitchen, and the profound wisdom he'd discovered in their seemingly simple way of life. The first few days back in Los Angeles passed in a blur of meetings and catch-up calls. His agent had stacked his calendar with potential projects, script readings, and interviews. Yet Hopkins found himself distracted, his thoughts drifting back to early morning conversations with Eli over steaming cups of coffee, the rhythm of farm work, and the authentic connections he'd formed with the Zook family. During a high-profile lunch meeting at Spago, Hopkins surprised his agent by turning down a leading role in a major studio blockbuster. The part would have meant another year of intense filming, promotional tours, and living out of hotel rooms. "I need something different," Hopkins explained, watching his agent's expression shift from confusion to concern. "Something with more substance, more humanity." The lessons from the Amish farm began manifesting in unexpected ways. Hopkins started declining invitations to glamorous Hollywood parties, preferring quiet evenings at home. He converted part of his expansive garden into a vegetable plot, remembering Eli's teachings about the importance of connecting with the earth. Though his first attempts at growing tomatoes were far from successful, the simple act of tending to plants brought him a sense of peace he'd rarely found on movie sets. His relationship with technology shifted dramatically. Following Hannah's example of mindful presence, Hopkins established phone-free zones in his home and set strict boundaries around his digital consumption. His publicist nearly had a meltdown when he announced his decision to limit his social media presence. But Hopkins stood firm, recalling Eli's words about the value of genuine human connection. The most significant change came in his approach to his craft. In script readings and character preparations, Hopkins found himself drawing upon the authentic emotions and experiences he'd witnessed in the Zook family. The raw honesty of Samuel's struggle between two worlds, the quiet strength of Hannah's devotion, and the profound wisdom in Eli's simple observations. These became the wellspring from which he drew his performances. One morning, while reading the entertainment news, Hopkins came across an article about an independent film project focusing on Amish life. The script had been floating around Hollywood for years, rejected by major studios for being too simple and lacking commercial appeal. Without hesitation, Hopkins contacted the filmmaker, offering not only to star in the project, but to help secure funding. The decision raised eyebrows in the industry. Why would an actor of his caliber choose a small character-driven story over lucrative mainstream offers? But Hopkins understood something now that had eluded him throughout much of his career. The most powerful stories often came from the simplest truths. He began advocating for more authentic storytelling in Hollywood, using his influence to support projects that explored genuine human experiences, rather than relying on special effects and artificial drama. In production meetings, he often found himself asking, "What would Eli think about this?" The question became his touchstone for authenticity. Letters began flowing between California and Pennsylvania. Hopkins shared his evolving journey with the Zooks, while they kept him updated on life on the farm. Each envelope from Hannah contained a new recipe, and though his attempts at recreating her dishes never quite matched the originals, the process connected him to the peace he'd found in their kitchen. Through Samuel, Hopkins learned about the challenges facing rural healthcare communities, leading him to establish a foundation supporting medical facilities in underserved areas. The project became a bridge between the modern world and traditional communities, much like Samuel himself had become. The entertainment press labeled Hopkins' transformation as a mid-career crisis, or a spiritual awakening, but those closest to him recognized something deeper. His experiences with the Zook family hadn't changed him so much as revealed what had been there all along: a yearning for authenticity, simplicity, and meaningful connection in an increasingly complex world. What would his next role be? How would this transformation continue to shape his career and life? As Hopkins sat in his garden watching his vegetables slowly grow, he realized these questions mattered far less than they once had. The real performance, he now understood, was not on any screen or stage, but in the daily act of living with purpose and authenticity. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds in Anthony Hopkins' Beverly Hills office, casting striped shadows across the thick script that lay unopened on his desk. The latest blockbuster offering from one of Hollywood's most prestigious studios, a role that would have once sent his agent into paroxysms of joy, now felt as substantial as tissue paper compared to the weight of his recent experiences. How could he explain to his longtime agent Marcus that spending time with an Amish farmer had fundamentally altered his perspective on what constituted meaningful work? The conversation played out in his mind as he absently traced the embossed lettering on the script's cover. The role offered everything Hollywood valued: a guaranteed box office draw, a hefty paycheck, and the kind of exposure that kept careers burning bright well into their sunset years. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his contemplation. "Mr. Hopkins, Marcus is here for your meeting," his assistant announced. The familiar voice of his agent preceded his entrance, already launching into an enthusiastic pitch about the project's potential. Marcus swept into the room, his designer suit and carefully maintained silver hair embodying everything about the industry that suddenly felt hollow to Hopkins. "Tony, this is exactly what we've been waiting for," Marcus declared, settling into the chair across from Hopkins. "The studio's already talking Oscar buzz and they're willing to adjust the shooting schedule to accommodate your other commitments." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "When was the last time a role like this came along?" Hopkins studied, his friend of 20 years, considering how to bridge the gulf between the person he'd been before his time with the Zooks and who he'd become, the lessons learned while working alongside Eli in the fields, the quiet wisdom shared over Hannah's home-cooked meals, and the profound understanding gained from witnessing Samuel's journey had transformed his definition of success. "Marcus," Hopkins began carefully, "do you remember what I told you about my time in Lancaster County?" He didn't wait for an answer. "While I was there, Eli Zook taught me something invaluable about the difference between doing what's expected and doing what's meaningful." The agent's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Tony, if this is about the script's message, we can work with the writers to—" "It's not about the script," Hopkins interrupted gently. "It's about what I want my legacy to be." He shared the story of Samuel Zook, the young man who'd chosen to leave his Amish community to become a doctor, and how his father Eli had eventually found peace with his son's decision to follow a different path. "Samuel chose substance over security," Hopkins explained. "He pursued something that would allow him to make a genuine difference in people's lives, even though it meant stepping away from everything familiar and safe." Marcus sat back, his promotional enthusiasm deflating. "Are you saying you want to quit acting?" A warm chuckle escaped Hopkins. "No, not at all. But I want to be more selective about the stories I tell. I want to take on projects that challenge perspectives, that make people question their assumptions. The way my time with the Zooks challenged mine." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a slim folder, pushing it across the desk to Marcus. "This is a small independent film script I received last week. It's about a retired teacher who starts a literacy program in a rural community. The budget is minimal, and the role isn't flashy. But the story—" Hopkins paused, thinking of Hannah's quiet strength as she'd supported both her husband and son through their struggles. "The story has heart." Marcus picked up the folder with visible reluctance. "Tony, you know I support your artistic choices, but turning down this offer, it could send the wrong message to the industry." "Perhaps," Hopkins acknowledged, "but it would send the right message to myself." He thought of Eli's weathered hands guiding his own as they worked in the fields, teaching him that true value often lay in the simplest acts done with genuine purpose. The agent's expression softened as he recognized the conviction in his client's voice. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" This time with the Amish family, it wasn't just research for a role. It was an education in what matters, Hopkins confirmed. "Eli showed me that authenticity isn't just about performance. It's about choosing actions that align with your deepest values." As Marcus began to read the independent film script, Hopkins reflected on how Samuel's courage to chart his own course had inspired this decision. The young doctor had chosen to heal bodies while Hopkins now sought to heal spirits through the stories he would tell. Different paths, but both driven by the same desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. The morning stretched on as agent and actor discussed the future, not in terms of box office numbers and award seasons, but in the language of impact and purpose. Outside the office window, Los Angeles continued its relentless pace, but within, Hopkins felt the same peace he'd discovered in Lancaster County's quiet fields. In the quiet solitude of his Welsh countryside home, Anthony Hopkins sat at his antique writing desk, fountain pen poised above cream-colored stationery. The morning light filtered through leaded glass windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like memories from his time with the Zook family. How does one capture transformation in words? The actor's recent decision to decline a blockbuster role had sparked headlines across Hollywood, but here, in this moment, his thoughts dwelled not on industry buzz but on the profound lessons learned during his stay with the Amish family. His pen touched paper, and words began to flow with surprising ease. "Dear Eli and Hannah," he wrote, the formal greeting feeling somehow inadequate for the depth of connection he now felt with these remarkable people. He shared how their simple way of life had challenged his perspectives on success, fame, and purpose. The letter spoke of morning chores in the barn with Eli, where wisdom flowed as naturally as milk into steel pails, and of Hannah's quiet strength that seemed to hold their world together. Hopkins found himself describing how their influence had altered his approach to his craft. The mindfulness he'd witnessed in Eli's woodworking now informed his character preparations. Hannah's patient attention to detail while quilting had taught him about the beauty of taking time, of allowing authenticity to emerge naturally rather than forcing performance. The letter took an unexpected turn as Hopkins addressed the complex dynamics he'd observed between Eli and Samuel. Without presumption, he shared how their situation had helped him understand his own relationships, both personal and professional. The courage it took for Samuel to forge his path while holding onto his roots resonated deeply with Hopkins' own journey in the entertainment industry. His pen paused over the paper as he considered the delicate balance between tradition and progress, remembering conversations with Hannah about her role in bridging these worlds. She had shown him how love could span the distance between old ways and new choices, her quiet wisdom offering insights that no acting coach had ever managed to convey. The actor found himself sharing how these lessons had already begun reshaping his career choices. The recent decision to step away from the high-profile role wasn't about money or prestige. It was about authenticity and purpose, values he'd seen lived out daily in the Zook household. What would Hollywood make of an approach to acting inspired by Amish principles? Hopkins detailed the ways their influence extended beyond his professional life. The peace he'd discovered during those dawn hours helping with farm chores had prompted him to simplify his own daily routines. He'd even begun working with his hands more, inspired by Eli's craftsmanship, finding that physical work provided a groundedness that no amount of meditation had achieved. The letter touched on moments shared around the Zook's kitchen table, where conversation flowed as freely as Hannah's coffee. Those discussions had revealed how universal human experiences transcended cultural boundaries. Whether in an Amish farmhouse or on a Hollywood set, people sought meaning, connection, and purpose. As he wrote about the impact of their hospitality, Hopkins reflected on how the experience had altered his understanding of community. The Amish emphasis on mutual support and shared responsibility offered a stark contrast to the individualistic entertainment industry. Could these principles find a place in his world of cameras and contracts? The letter grew longer as Hopkins shared his hopes for maintaining their connection, despite the vast differences in their daily lives. He expressed gratitude for their willingness to open their home and hearts to someone from such a different world. Their acceptance had offered him a gift beyond measure, the opportunity to see himself and his choices through new eyes. In closing, Hopkins found himself writing of legacy, not the kind measured in awards or box office numbers, but the kind he'd witnessed in the Zook family. The way Eli's craftsmanship would live on through his work, how Hannah's strength shaped their family's future, and how Samuel's courage to chart his own course, while honoring his roots, represented a different kind of success story. What emerged on those pages was more than a thank you note. It was a testament to the unexpected ways lives intersect and transform each other. As Hopkins signed his name, He wondered how these words would be received in that quiet farmhouse where his own journey of discovery had begun. Anthony Hopkins sat at his mahogany desk in his Los Angeles home, the same spot where months ago he had frantically searched for answers about portraying an Amish father. The morning sun filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on the scattered papers before him. Scripts, notes, and most importantly, the letters from the Zook family. His fingers traced the careful penmanship of Hannah's latest correspondence, her words bringing the scent of fresh-baked bread and the sound of clip-clopping hooves back to his consciousness. The panic that had once gripped him about portraying Eli's character had transformed into something deeper, an understanding that went beyond mere acting technique. Through the exchange of letters, Hopkins learned how Samuel had settled into his medical practice, gradually rebuilding bridges with his father. Eli's initial resistance had softened, shaped by the conversations he and Hopkins had shared during those transformative summer days. Hannah's gentle influence continued to serve as the family's emotional compass, helping both men navigate their evolving relationship. The latest script revision lay open beside him, but Hopkins no longer needed to study it obsessively. The character lived within him now, born from the quiet moments of watching Eli tend his fields, the shared meals at the Zook's table, and the profound conversations that stretched late into the evening. How could he have known that his greatest acting lesson would come not from technique or method, but from simply being present in another man's life? A photograph caught his eye. One Hannah had sent, showing Eli and Samuel standing together at the farm's gate. The tension visible in earlier photos had mellowed into something more comfortable, more accepting. Hopkins remembered Eli's words about letting go, about understanding that love sometimes meant watching someone choose a different path. The morning's schedule demanded his attention, a production meeting, costume fittings, preliminary shots. Yet Hopkins found himself lingering over the letters, each one a reminder of the unexpected wisdom he'd gained. The film industry's artificial urgency seemed less important now, tempered by memories of Eli's patient approach to life and work. His phone buzzed with messages from producers and directors, but Hopkins's thoughts drifted to the question Samuel had asked during their last conversation. How do you measure success? The answer had seemed obvious then: awards, recognition, critical acclaim. Now Hopkins understood success differently, shaped by the Zook family's example of finding purpose in one's chosen path, while honoring the bonds that tied them together. Hannah's letters often included updates about the community, births, marriages, the rhythm of seasonal work. These glimpses into their continuing lives reminded Hopkins that his experience with the Zooks hadn't been just research for a role. It had become a lesson in authentic living, in finding meaning beyond the spotlight. The character he would portray on screen had evolved from his original conception. Instead of focusing on the external details of Amish life, Hopkins now understood the deeper currents of faith, family, and forgiveness that shaped Eli's world. The story had become more than a dramatic exploration of cultural differences. It was a testament to the universal struggle of maintaining connections across the chasms of choice and change. Rising from his desk, Hopkins moved to the window. The sprawling city stretched before him, a stark contrast to the peaceful farmland he'd left behind. Yet he no longer felt the disconnect that had troubled him before. The wisdom gained from Eli, the warmth of Hannah's welcome, and the bridge building example of Samuel's journey had shown him how different worlds could coexist within one's heart. The morning sun continued its climb, reminding Hopkins of early mornings in the Zook's kitchen, of Hannah's quiet efficiency and Eli's steadfast presence. These memories weren't just research material anymore. They had become part of his own story, transforming not just his approach to the role, but his understanding of what truly mattered in life. What began as a desperate search for character insight had become a journey of personal transformation. The panic that once drove him to seek answers had been replaced by a peace that came from understanding that some questions didn't need immediate answers, that some learning happened in the quiet spaces between words and actions. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.